This is the first in a series of videos in which I'll review multiple aspects of Skull and Bones as I play it more and more. Next week I'll focus on the endgame and seasonal content, and I plan to release a new review every week as my opinions develop. This video will focus on the base game before the seasonal content is added, and the context that's made it so difficult to support before it was even released. So, what did I think of Skull and Bones? As you can see in the title, Skull and Bones sits in the shadow of Assassin's Creed 4 Black Flag in every aspect of its design. It rips out huge portions of what made that game great, including almost any semblance of a story, on-foot combat, and an interesting protagonist. Those elements have been crudely replaced with a light RPG system, world events, and poor quality animations that fail in every aspect to replace the on-foot combat experience that made Black Flag so successful. Essentially, this game, releasing in 2024 after being in development for 11 years, is fundamentally worse than a game released in 2013. This game was quite literally born in a position where it was practically guaranteed success, but through some baffling design choices and game mechanic replacements, manages to somehow make worse almost every element of a game released over 10 years and 2 console generations ago. Looking at Skull and Bones comparatively, it's an utterly baffling failure to enhance the gameplay of a game that offered every one of the basics that Ubisoft needed to create an open world pirate game. But I'm not going to solely look at this game comparatively, because to do that would be to ignore the many ways in which Skull and Bones succeeds in making an engaging pirate RPG that's not only accessible, but surprisingly deep and filled with content. So Skull and Bones, taken by its own merits and removed from the context of Black Flag, is it any good? It's a complicated question, and it totally depends on what you're looking for in a game like this, but in my opinion, Skull and Bones has some strong foundations that could potentially lead to a promising future, although that future completely depends on why you're coming to this game. There's another aspect of Skull and Bones that's impossible to ignore, besides its relationship with Assassin's Creed 4 Black Flag, and that's the way it's been marketed to customers. Not only is this a game that's a heftily priced £70 game in the UK, which is still a rarity for many games over here, but the CEO of Ubisoft, Yves Guillemot, has frequently described Skull and Bones as the first ever quadruple A game. Now, I have a fair amount of tolerance for corporate nonsense in the way that high-ups choose to promote their games, but this statement is total bullshit. This is not a quadruple A game, and in fact, it frequently struggles to live up to the standards and expectations of a AAA game. This is a buggy, inconsistent, graphically average game that has several missing qualities that even a AAA game is expected to have. Things like the quality of the cutscenes, the terrible, awkward voice acting, the shabby and quite frankly incredibly disappointing boarding animation, and the extremely poor and cheesy resource mining minigames are areas where many AA games and even many indie games have outdone Skull and Bones. To hear Yves Guillemot describe this game as a quadruple A live service game is not only a lie in order to please his shareholders, but it's also just misleading to customers. It created a stink around this game that made it harder to support and easier to ridicule, and it really doubled down on the reality that games are often far easier to sell if out of touch, lying CEOs don't open their mouths. It's a new low for Guillemot, who's widely known for his ability to say the opposite of what people want to hear. The £70 price point that Skull and Bones has will also be a massive turn off for potential customers, as this is a live service game that lacks a campaign and launches with a fair amount of content that really only presents itself properly at the endgame. It's a familiar tune of too many live service games in the last 5 years or so, only showing the player all that they have to offer after they reach the endgame, which can be 20 to 40 hours after they begin the main game. I've played about 22 hours of Skull and Bones so far, and I can say with absolute conviction that many people will like what they run into when they get deeper into the game and reach the end game, but the pointlessly slow start that this game offers new players will make an equal number of people bounce off and search for more instantly rewarding experiences. If you want to hear more of my thoughts on the more negative aspects of this game, stick around until the second half of the video where I'll be going over what issues I have with it, but first, let's go over the positives. So, after my 22 hours with the game, what did I like about Skull and Bones? Let's take a look at combat and RPG systems. One of the areas where Skull and Bones really succeeds is in ship control and combat. The ships in Skull and Bones control really well. They glide across the water, almost as if they're not huge heavy things made out of wood that sit a few feet under the surface. But Skull and Bones isn't pretending to be a simulator, so I don't mind. They manoeuvre and turn quickly and easily, and while that isn't the most realistic, it does allow the combat system to come into its own. Combat in Skull and Bones is very different to how it was in Black Flag. Black Flag was a game about making sure that you were in the best place possible to place your shot, so that when you fired your cannons, you could guarantee it would hit its target. Combat in Skull and Bones, however, is far more about accuracy than it is about positioning. That's all down to the reticle system, which replaces the trajectory markers that dictated combat in Black Flag. The reticle allows players more flexibility with aiming, as you aren't limited to whatever exact position the cannons are facing. Not the most realistic system, that's for sure, but it's fun and allows you to tackle multiple ships at the same time. That's important, as in the later stages of the game, you'll be doing exactly that, so the ability to aim without having to turn your ship to an exact angle is a real advantage. There's also the weak point system. As you shoot, several regions of the ship you're shooting will glow red, allowing you to target them and deal additional damage. Certain types of cannons will do increased amounts of damage if you manage to hit those weak points, such as long guns, and there are other ways of buffing the damage you can do to various parts of enemy ships. That's where the buildcraft of Skull and Bones comes in, and the one area where I'm forced to give Skull and Bones a lot of praise is how you're able to customize your ship. It's one of, if not the best part of the experience, as you can choose from a large variety of different guns, armour and furniture to outfit your ship with. It all adds up to create a nicely done sandbox which allows you to not only build your own loadout and make a ship that caters to your specific playstyle, but also if you're playing with friends, it gives you a good reason to build a team loadout. Ships come in various classes, for example. A DPS ship that does a significant amount of damage but has less health and shields, or a tank ship that's far slower and does less damage but can carry a lot of items in its hold and has a significant shield to block attacks. There are guns that heal other ships, guns that do AoE damage, guns that are designed to open up enemy holes for your crew to shoot at, and guns that cause fire damage, to name but a few. In short, there are many different ways to build your ship in Skull and Bones, and that's even before adding in the armour system and furniture, which go a long way to expand the options there are for increasing the utility of your ship. There are a lot of problems with Skull and Bones, but ship customization and combat aren't among them. In fact, if you want to see my other thoughts on the combat, you should check out my review of the beta, as I covered the combat there, and my feelings are similar to how they were then. One difference to my previous review is that I found that my main concern, which was that combat would get boring, never actually happened. I've now played 14 hours more than I had during the beta, and the combat in Skull and Bones has remained consistently enjoyable and accessible, partly due to the very strong grounding of basics there are here, and partly due to the exceptional amount of customization and loadout options there are available here. But how does all this play out in leveling your ship up and progressing? Let's do RPG systems and progression. There are many layers that go into Skull and Bones' progression system. I'll lay them out for you. The first and most important layer is your notoriety. Notoriety determines what items you're able to unlock and use, and gates your progression to endgame systems such as the Helm, which I'll talk more about in my next video. It also has an effect on how NPCs in Skull and Bones treat you, with earlier NPCs treating you with disdain and almost disgust, to practically bowing down as you walk down the alleyway later on. Even vendors will begin referring to how they've heard of you before as you try to buy something from them, and it really adds to your pirate fantasy. One thing that I'm interested to see how Skull and Bones manages is the multiple levels of notoriety when you reach the Kingpin level. Once you hit Kingpin rank, which I have, you've effectively unlocked everything available in the base game. There are 100 Kingpin levels, and I'm interested to see how Ubisoft are going to encourage players to keep grinding once they progress past level 1. The second level of progression is campaign and mission progression, which sends you to various points around the map and unlocks a whole lot of contracts for you to complete. I'm sure you all know how Ubisoft games work considering their structure, and this is very much the same. I'm going to have to say more about the campaign later on, as to say that Skull and Bones has a campaign is kind of like saying that Assassin's Creed Valhalla is a stealth game because it has a hidden blade in it. Moving past that particular can of worms, there's the third major progression path, which is your ship level. The way that this works is that each ship has a base level, which you can then level up using the armour, weapons and furniture that you equip to it. Each item that you unlock has a blueprint attached to it before you can find out what materials that you need to craft it, and those can be found at various vendors across the world, as well as given out as contract rewards, etc. It all adds up wonderfully well, and that in Skull and Bones, anything and everything you do is more than likely advancing some form of the game's progression. This creates a fantastic feeling of growth which never goes away, as there's a hell of a lot of content to engage with here. That's the one thing that you won't hear me complain about today, as Skull and Bones may be flawed significantly for reasons that I'll discover in the latter half of this video, but it launches more feature complete and with more to do than a solid 70% of live service games that have launched in the last 5 years. That doesn't mean that the content is necessarily good, but it does mean that if it clicks with you, you're going to have a lot to progress through and a lot to do for many, many hours. I personally really enjoyed it. I don't have the patience or the time for many of the gameplay loops employed by modern day live service games, but something about the massive amount of busy work in Skull and Bones just hit right with me, and I'm really glad to say that for me personally, there's a lot to enjoy here. Of course, I'm reviewing this game from both an objective and a subjective point of view, so there are definitely still issues, but from a progression point of view, Skull and Bones is very solid. Overall, I'd say that the combat and RPG systems of Skull and Bones serve it well, and some people will really click with it because of how good these two things are. Unfortunately though, those two systems aren't the only things that define what Skull and Bones is. I'm now going to go over my significant issues with what Skull and Bones offers at launch, followed by going back to my earliest comparison of Assassin's Creed 4 Black Flag. If you've gotten this far in the review, consider joining us and subscribing. And just to make it very clear, this isn't the part of the video where I have a rant about what Skull and Bones could have been. This is where I'm going to talk about the problems with what Skull and Bones is actually trying to be. And for the record, there are several issues with what Skull and Bones is, beyond its lack of off-ship combat. The first is animations. Skull and Bones seems like it's a step back from almost any other AAA or even AA game this generation in facial animations. When the first pirate captain you meet is talking, he looks like a shark for no apparent reason. His teeth are bizarrely low res, and his lip syncing is so off it's almost comical. Admittedly, the main characters are nothing like as bad, such as John Skurlock, but it's still very lackluster when compared to any other games of this magnitude, and especially ones that cost this much to make. The facial animations aren't the only poor animations in Skull and Bones, however, as you've got the terrible, or, well, non-existent water animations when you're on dry lands. It's been trending online recently that Black Flag has better water animations than Skull and Bones does, and that's an area where we can objectively compare the two games, as the water animations and sounds here are truly horrendous when you're not on your ship. Not only does the water not make any sound whatsoever, but your player will walk straight through the water as if it isn't even there. It's the last and possibly greatest insult to the bullshit notion of Skull and Bones being more than your average AAA game. It's a pirate game that doesn't even have a swimming animation or wave sounds when you're on the shore. Like, have you ever heard of a game that doesn't give you those basic interactions? It just makes these small locations where you can get out of your ship feel like late development additions, and makes me more and more certain that these islands were never designed to be explored. Skull and Bones isn't only lacking in the animation category when it comes to appearance, however. It's also just a very average looking game. Not once did I look at it and think of how realistic the water looked, as I often do in Sea of Thieves, or think of how brilliant the explosions looked as I regularly do in Helldivers 2. It's incredibly disappointing, as this game, released 11 years after Black Flag, is often outshone by a game released 2 generations ago, and I'm talking graphically here. This was a point reiterated by a reviewer on YouTube named Skillup, who commented that the explosions in Skull and Bones were wildly unrealistic and that he preferred the way the ship damage worked in Black Flag. And quite honestly, I agree. These giant explosions that happen whenever you hit an enemy ship are just bizarre, as what are you actually exploding here? Like, it's a giant wooden boat, and these enormous explosions are going off every time you hit it with a metal cannonball, and it's just baffling. In Black Flag, as Skillup so effectively pointed out, ships will spray wooden chips and shrapnel everywhere. The explosions happen when you hit a ship's supply of explosive barrels, and that makes sense. Skull and Bones, I know does it for dramatic effect, but it makes no sense to me, and I don't like it. And one more nitpick before I move on to the major stuff: why does your ship have stamina? I know that in other games such as Assassin's Creed Valhalla, your crew were rowing the ship, so having a stamina meter actually made sense. But in this game, you use the wind in your sails to travel. What's even going on here? Is your ship getting tired? Honestly, I have no idea. But I suspect that this is just another way to make use of the massive amount of food that you end up plundering throughout your exploits at sea. I usually end up throwing out most of the food I've stolen. It's almost totally useless, and takes up valuable cargo space. It's yet another example of adding content for the sake of content, like so many of the game systems we see shoehorned into games that don't suit them. And this mechanic actually makes Skull and Bones worse, as it slows down your often long journeys across the map. The section of the review that I've just given you is full of issues with Skull and Bones, but they're actually just the smaller issues. The bigger, more fatal ones are the issues that I'm going to tell you about in this section upcoming. Let's talk story and material gathering. I'm well aware that a live service game doesn't need an elaborate story to be successful. It needs to have strong gameplay, backed up by even stronger incentives to engage with that gameplay. Skull and Bones doesn't throw itself into a story by any means, but it does offer something. That something is remarkably boring. Remember those memes of getting an AI bot to read 1,000 hours of a story before writing its own short story based on that story? The stories that they came up with would have been both more interesting and more engaging than what Ubisoft came up with after 11 years. The main characters are one-dimensional and uninteresting, and the side characters are essentially window dressing, designed as equipment vendors so that you can buy the crafting items and blueprints that you need to progress your game. It's all very skin deep and tacked on. Talking of tacked on, I think that the biggest issue that Skull and Bones has is actually something that connects us very nicely to a different, much older game. Before I discuss material gathering in Skull and Bones, let's quickly pivot to Assassin's Creed 4 Black Flag. Released in 2013, Assassin's Creed 4 Black Flag was the quintessential Assassin's Creed game of the 2010s for many, many people, but it was also one of the best pirate games ever released. It provided a gripping story, with characters that made you care about what happened to them, a huge, constantly engaging world, and the best ship combat that had ever existed, some would say before or since. It all revolved around Edward Kenway, privateer turned pirate turned master assassin, and involved historical figures such as Blackbeard as they fought to keep control over the pirate way of life. It had an in-depth ship upgrade system, looting, hunting, sea combat, sea monsters, special pirate ships that took time and planning to take out, and above all, it respected your time. It's here that we meet the most fatal error that Skull and Bones makes. If we describe and review Skull and Bones pretending that Black Flag doesn't exist as I have today, then there's a lot of merit to be had here. There's the arcade-like but surprisingly deep ship combat, the hunting sharks and other creatures, the fighting enemy ships and the looting. But Black Flag does exist, and the fatal issue for Skull and Bones is it already did every last one of the things it did well, but it did them better, and Black Flag was released 11 years ago. The entire point of Skull and Bones is that it seeks to provide its players with the ultimate pirate fantasy, but it does so while adding a frustrating grind that repeatedly has the player headbutting large material costs that, while not seeming too huge on the surface, require a huge amount of time and travelling to reach. Every time I unlocked a new blueprint, I groaned, because I knew that each blueprint meant multiple materials that I'd need to grind for. There's also no way to get these materials besides interacting with boring, lifeless NPCs, plundering enemy ships on specific trade routes, or the aforementioned material harvesting, which is possibly the worst, most out of place and frustrating mechanic that Skull and Bones has. Do you know what the developers at Ubisoft have implemented instead of a physical material harvesting system? You park your ship next to some trees, press a button, wait for the minigame to pop up, and play this stupid little game where you click whenever your saw is in the middle of a meter in the green section. At no point during this process does a single member of your crew leave the ship. What the hell is even happening here? Is your ship cutting down trees? Who knows, but what I do know is this is one of the many ridiculous, half-baked mechanics that Ubisoft has added in to make sure that Skull and Bones can generate a forced grind and make players sink more and more hours into what feels like dull busy work to fill the enormous gaps that exist due to the removal of so much of Black Flag's content. It's a problem when Skull and Bones' biggest competitor was a game made 11 years ago by the same company. And it's a problem that in those 11 years, no progress has been made in evolving the content that was offered in that game. The only thing that's clear while playing Skull and Bones is that Ubisoft have looked at Black Flag, asked themselves what they can get away with removing to add elements of grinding, and then they've proceeded to do exactly that, taking the soul of Black Flag away in the process. It all revolves around the baffling decision to remove all off-ship combat from Skull and Bones, a decision that was clearly made early on, and the solutions that they've added have put sellotape on what's become a gaping, gushing hole in the game's design. So many of Skull and Bones' problems could have been forgiven if there was a convincing gameplay loop here, and for a very certain few people there is, but for most, Skull and Bones just seems overly grindy, filled with boring busy work that makes progress drag by at a snail's pace. And I say all this because, as I said before, Skull and Bones is a game that was made to fulfill a player's pirate fantasy. But the issue is that that game already exists in Black Flag, or even something such as Sea of Thieves for a more arcade-like experience. But okay, let's wrap up the first part of this review so that I can summarise everything that I've said so far, and let's go on to the conclusion. So I've said a lot about Skull and Bones in this review, but what do I think about the package as a whole? Well, Skull and Bones isn't all bad. It's got a flexible combat system with a lot more variety and customization than it suggests at the beginning. It's always fun to plunder enemy ships and challenge yourself to take on enemy bases. The same can be said about the leveling system, which is consistently rewarding and makes sure that you're on the right track whatever you're doing. Even the plundering system means that you're accumulating a lot of loot that will be useful later on as you find more advanced blueprints. I want to stress this point very clearly. Skull and Bones offers a lot of content at launch, and some people will really enjoy what's available here. At the same time, however, and most importantly, the majority of that content would be what most people consider busy work. Therefore, I think that this game will struggle to maintain a consistent player base. In fact, I think that Skull and Bones, due to both its positioning as apparently quadruple A game and a £70 offering, will struggle to justify itself to most people who come across it. This is a game that spends a lot of time getting you to do things, but doesn't make those things exciting enough or provide actual rewards quickly enough to make most people gel with what these things are. I just struggle to see how Skull and Bones will survive for what Ubisoft says will be a good long time, as I don't believe there'll be a market for this game for long enough to justify them spending even more money on what feels like a sinking ship. Even look at the fact that Sea of Thieves is coming to PS5 and potentially Switch soon. That alone might be enough to kill the appeal of Skull and Bones. And when Black Flag is taken into account, Skull and Bones becomes a colossal failure, a regression of almost every success that made Black Flag so great, stuffed to the brim of life service elements and robbed of its soul in the process. Stick with me for the next few weeks as I review Skull and Bones' endgame content, seasonal content and aftermath, as I'll be uploading every Friday for the next month to cover what I believe is a broken ship slowly taking on water. It may have a good endgame, which remains to be seen, and I'll be exploring it next week, but I just don't think that what's here in the base game is good enough or engaging enough for the majority of people to stick around. Skull and Bones isn't a total disaster, but it relies far too much on a broken and dysfunctional life service model, grindy and dull gameplay mechanics, and a baffling lack of on-foot combat that regresses everything that Ubisoft has learned in the past 11 years to possibly be considered a success. That's why, while Skull and Bones has merits of its own, it will always sit in the shadow of a far superior game, Assassin's Creed 4 Black Flag. Remember to subscribe, like the video, and make sure that notifications are turned on so that you know when the next chapter of my Skull and Bones review story goes live. See you very soon, and I hope you enjoyed the video.